When diving into the ocean of your own soul, it helps to know what lies beneath the surface. Maybe that water is crystal clear, but maybe it's full of sea monsters. Now either way, it's always a hero's journey. But when you know those waters are especially dark and dangerous, it helps to know what might be in store for you. And that's why having some idea of your own degree of life trauma is especially important before you take the plunge. Now, normally most people think of trauma as related to child abuse, and that is by far the most damaging form of trauma that I've come across. However, as I talked about in my video on trauma, it can come in surprising forms. Experiences from any time in our lives can have a powerful effect on us, such as witnessing a murder or being in a fire. But we can also be affected by traumatic events which we have no conscious memory of, like being an unwanted pregnancy. But regardless of the shape these traumas take, there does seem to be a general rule, which is that the more traumatic your life experience is, the more difficult your experience on the other side will be. You see, once you're into the so-called psychosis, there is a tremendous opportunity to heal the wounds you carry from those experiences in life that you would rather forget, or may have completely forgotten. However, before the healing can take place, there's a catch. And that catch is that you need to re-experience the trauma first. And that's the hard part. You see, as long as that sea monster is swimming in the deep, he's outside of your awareness, even though he's always there. In order to get rid of him, you need to let him come to the surface, where you can see and feel all of his ugliness in the light of day. And it's in this process of allowing our sea monsters, or our traumas, to become completely conscious, emotionally and intellectually, that they finally disappear. Now, the good news in all of this is that during the acute psychosis, it's often possible to rid yourself of painful experiences which may have haunted you for years, and this can happen in just a matter of hours or even minutes. All that needs to take place is that you need to open yourself emotionally to what you're feeling inside. And that can be a scary thing because some of the energies connected to these traumas can be very powerful. It's not uncommon for people to be crying, screaming, or even blacking out when these experiences happen. And so for many people in this situation, sensing the emotional pain and memories arising within, it's tempting to simply try and block whatever's happening within you. Playing loud music, talking nonstop, or even doubling up on the meds. But for the true healing to take place, you really need to let go. And so because trauma is such an important factor to consider, I've added it to the model here because, as I said, all things being equal, the more trauma that is within you, the more difficult and fearful your process will be. And so that's why on the left I'm connecting heavy trauma with high fear, and on the right, light trauma with low fear. And if you take a look at my video on hallucinations, you'll see that I've already found a relationship between a heavy amount of trauma and schizophrenia. And it should come as no surprise that the people at the opposite end of the spectrum, those having the very positive spiritual experiences, had very few difficult traumas to deal with in their experience of psychosis or in their life history. Now, I'm sure there are many people out there with bipolar disorder that don't consider their lives to be particularly traumatic, and that may be the case. However, there is one other type of trapped energy which we carry within us that needs to surface when you're in a typical manic psychosis, and that is the energy of repressions. You see, as we move from the one perspective reality of the feudal level into the two perspective world of the traditional level, we learn to repress our emotions. Now, as I talked about in a previous video, learning to repress emotions is an important skill as it helps you get along with people better. However, some people become overly repressed, feeling that they can never truly be themselves. That's why I've called bipolar disorder I can't be me disorder. And based on the people I've talked to, I would say that it's the repression of your true self or inner spirit, which is often a big part of why people go into psychosis. So you see, as opposed to someone with very deep psychological problems who's perhaps had a lifetime of difficulties relating to people, many people with bipolar disorder were in fact the opposite. Top of their class, straight-A students, popular and charismatic. It's just that perhaps the expectations they felt they needed to live up to may have become too much for them, or in fact didn't really reflect who they were as a person. So as opposed to being in the more traumatized lower left-hand corner of our chart, most of the people diagnosed with bipolar disorder that I've talked to would find themselves towards the upper right, dealing with some trauma but also a fair amount of emotional repression. Now, some of you might be asking, if people in the far upper right-hand corner are already at a higher level of consciousness and have less trauma or repressions to deal with than others, then why would they enter into a psychosis at all? Well, starting with the modern level of consciousness, we begin to question our own reality. And at first, we challenge the thinking of our culture, questioning our religious beliefs, cultural obligations, or even superstitions that might be left over from the lower levels. But at the postmodern level, we begin to question everything, even our own rational mind. Here, the world somehow opens up, and the sense of wonder we had as children returns, especially as we begin to see how our own thoughts, feelings, and attitudes directly impact or even help create our own reality. And so in order to create a better world for themselves, people become much more introspective at the postmodern level, questioning the limitations of their own consciousness in order for them to improve. As a result, people in or near the postmodern level are often enthusiastically involved in activities which, whether they know it or not, put them on a course for breaking out of their own ego or false self, and possibly into a very positive spiritual psychosis or spiritual emergency. Now, these activities may include intensive self-help seminars, spiritual retreats, reading a very inspiring book could be a trigger, or even foreign travel in the name of finding yourself. Pretty much any highly stimulating, thought-provoking activity could be part of the ego-breaking triggers that takes you into psychosis, including watching videos from Bipolar or Waking Up. Now, are traumas and repression still a factor here? Sure they are. It's just that for those in the upper right, the psychosis they find themselves in is often caused, quite accidentally, by their own efforts to expand their level of consciousness. And this brings me to another interesting aspect of this model, because based on the people I've talked to, it seems to me that when it comes to the life circumstances or triggers which cause someone to go into their first psychosis, the people in the upper right usually have many triggers happening, while those in the lower left have few, if any. For example, a typical upper right bipolar psychosis involves moving away to university. The combination of a new school in a new city, being away from family and old friends, being introduced to new ideas, and then maybe seeing your grades drop, plus smoking a lot of marijuana. This combination of triggers could initiate a psychosis in just about anybody. On the other hand, someone hallucinating devils at the age of 14 or 15 may not be able to remember any specific triggers causing their first episode. So as opposed to people on the upper right, who usually have many triggers to their first acute psychosis, those on the lower left usually only have one or two, as it's the severity of the trauma that they've been through that is primarily responsible for their first episode. So, it's been a long journey, but a satisfying one, because I think I finally got a pretty good answer to my question. If you remember from part 1, I started out looking for the difference between a spiritual awakening and bipolar disorder, but then in realizing that there was actually no definitive separation between a spiritual awakening or a spiritual emergency, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia, I then asked what are the key factors which would lead to someone having a more positive, negative, or mixed episode of psychosis. And those key factors turned out to be consciousness and trauma. And knowing this, we can start to look at the spectrum of psychosis in a whole new way. You see, it's important to remember that up until now, according to psychiatry, all episodes of acute psychosis should be medicated, and most people become medicated for life. And that even among the most open-minded psychiatrists and psychologists, there's been a genuine frustration in the inability to clearly define a spiritual experience from insanity. However, what our model shows is that there will never be a clear diagnostic criteria to separate one experience from the other. And so rather than looking at these experiences in black and white terms of spiritual or insanity, we can now assess someone's probability of healing based on our model. And what we'll find is that for people approaching the upper right-hand side, there will be a high probability of having healing, even spiritual breakthroughs. Having much more fearful, traumatic experiences, those people in the lower left-hand side of the model will have a lower probability of healing, as it's much more difficult for those people to engage the material that they're confronted with. And as for people labeled with bipolar disorder, as always, they fall somewhere in the middle, usually having mixed episodes of love and fear. And for these people, their probability of healing can be good, provided that they're given the education and support necessary to help them work through their processes. Because in truth, wherever you would find yourself in this model, every acute psychosis has at least the potential of transforming into a spiritually healing experience.